Steps in action research. There are various steps which are involved while designing action research. And as researchers, we should know that what are those steps which are involved and which are important to be taken before finalizing your study as an action research. We know that action research is an organized, investigative activity, and which is based on bringing in change for improvement, right? So that's the very informal definition of action research. While keeping this action research in mind, if we want to decide that we need to go for action research for solving our problem, then we are required to follow particular steps. So step number one is that we are supposed to decide and to select a problem, right? Because that's the starting point for any action research project, right? It starts with a problem which is faced by any practitioner, right? It could be any kind of problem, but it must be involved in the practical context, in the practical environment of teaching and learning, particularly when it is action research based on education, right? So we are starting with a problem. We must be able to explain, to define, to explore formally, informally the problem. Because the more depth is involved, the more in-depth analysis of the problem is involved, the more solid, the more authentic and reliable study is to be accomplished. So that's the point that we should start with the selection of problem. When the problem is selected and we know it from inside outside, and we have thoroughly defined the problem statement, the research problem, then we are required to hypothesize about that problem, right? That what could be the immediate solution of that problem, right? So any researcher who is going to take up action research as the project of the person, then the second step is to formulate a hypothesis, right? And the hypothesis is basically based on the problem. Hypothesis is the tentative, answer to the research question, or might be the tentative solution to the problem, right? So that is the hypothesis. The third step is to design of research, and within the design of research, when you are to design a research, then you are required to decide the sample, right? So how would you, the sampling technique, that how would you decide your sample? How would you take your sample, right? And what is going to be your sample? Like what's going to be the number of the sample? What's going to be, the specification of the sample, right? So are you going to take teachers as your sample, students, their sections, their institutions, right? And which medium of their interaction? Might be you're working on the language of teaching and learning environment, right? So you are to decide your sampling, right? The sampling technique and samples, right? And then you are required to decide your methodology, that which is going to be your methodology. What steps are involved? How would you take data? How would you collect data? Like what instruments you would be using to collect data? Is it going to be a questionnaire or a survey or an interview or observation, right? So how would you collect data? That's the part of the methodology. And once the data is collected, how would you decide the analysis? What procedures you would involve for analysis? And how would you make sense of the results, right? How would you interpret your results? How would you write down your findings, right? So these are the points which are related to methodology. So you would decide your methodology along with your sampling. And then you would collect data, right? While using your, procedures, you would collect data. It could be the administration of any tool and scoring, right? So first you decide that how would you plan, how would you go, and then you do the practical. So first you decided about your sampling and sampling techniques and the methodology, and now it's time to take the action. So you are now collecting data. And the collection of data is followed by the analysis of data. And the analysis of data is a step where you would also, very carefully decide that how would you carry out your analysis, right? Is it going to be very simple analysis, or you would involve the complexity of the, analysis? You would be using a software, or you would be using some statistical tools, techniques, and softwares like SPSS or Excel sheet, or any, qualitative, quantitative software like NVivo or Hyper Research. So you are required to decide. And then when you are done with your analysis, then you would formulate your conclusion, right? So when you are formulating your conclusion, you would be again looking for consistencies. You would be looking for the applied side of the methodology and the design, right? And once the conclusion is prepared, it is reported, then you would also think about the follow-up questions, the recommendations, right? The recommendations, it must be based, if it's an educational research, it must be based on pedagogical implications, right? And implications for policy and practices. So how would you then send your report to those community of practices, right? As we know that action research is always based on solving problems, the problems of practitioners. So how would you send your recommendations to practitioners and the community of practice, right? So that point should also be taken. And these are the steps which are involved in action research.